The rain fell on New York City in relentless grey sheets, as if trying to wash the sin from its grimy streets. It was a fool's errand. Sin was the city's lifeblood, its currency, and on this sweltering August night in 1926, it flowed most freely in the illicit cellars and hidden back rooms where the law was merely a suggestion. Deep beneath a respectable tailor's shop in Hell's Kitchen, in a haze of cigar smoke and the cloying scent of bootleg gin, was the gilded cage. On its small velvet-draped stage, bathed in the amber glow of a single spotlight, stood Evelyn Reed, her voice a mournful ribbon of smoke and honey coiled around the room, silencing the clinking glasses and hushed conversations. She sang a blues melody of loss, a song that felt born of the rain-soaked pavement outside. Her slender frame was clad in a simple jet-black beaded dress that shimmered like a pool of oil with every slight movement. Her dark hair was bobbed in the flapper style, but there was nothing frivolous about her. It was in her eyes, deep, sorrowful pools of twilight grey that held a story far older than her 23 years. The crowd was rapt. They saw a beautiful singer, a canary in a cage, trilling a sad, lovely tune for their entertainment. But Evelyn wasn't singing for them. She was singing for the ghost that haunted her waking moments and stalked her dreams. Her brother, Eugene. Each note was a memory, each pause a breath he would never take again. His face, once so full of life and reckless laughter, was now a faded photograph on her dresser and a permanent ache behind her ribs. Singing was the only time the ache subsided, replaced by a clean, sharp pang of grief she could almost control. In a darkened corner booth, shielded from the casual glances of patrons, a man sat utterly still. He was a creature of shadow and silence in a room defined by noise and light. His suit was dark, impeccably tailored, its sharp lines a testament to a discipline that bordered on severity. A glass of amber whiskey sat untouched before him, the ice within it slowly surrendering to the room's oppressive heat. He did not watch Evelyn as the other men did, with hunger or casual appreciation. He watched her with the unnerving focus of a predator studying its prey, or a collector appraising a priceless, flawed diamond. This was Arthur Sterling. The name was rarely spoken above a whisper in places like this, because he owned them. He owned the gin in their glasses, the roof over their heads, and, in many cases, the secrets in their hearts. He was a veteran of the Great War, and the hell he had witnessed in the trenches of France had burned away everything but a cold, calculating core. Now, he waged a different kind of war on the streets of New York, a war of territory, power, and fear, and he was winning. He had been watching Evelyn Reed for 3 weeks. He had learned of her through whispers, a singer at the gilded cage with the voice of a fallen angel. But it wasn't her voice that held him captive, it was the sorrow that fueled it. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same vacant hollowness he sometimes saw in his own reflection. It was the look of someone who had seen the world rip away something precious and had been left to stand alone in the wreckage. He knew her brother Eugene had been one of Clarence the Butcher Gallows' unfortunate victims, a small-time bookie who got in over his head, but rumor had it that Eugene's sister had been nearby, had heard something on the night he was killed, something useful. Arthur Sterling dealt in useful things. Evelyn held the final note, letting it hang in the air until it dissolved into the smoky atmosphere. For a heartbeat, the club was silent, suspended in the fragile beauty of her lament. Then applause erupted, a wave of noise and appreciation that seemed to make her flinch. She gave a small, practiced curtsy, the spotlight catching the exhaustion on her face, and turned to step down from the stage. That was when the world exploded. The heavy oak door to the speakeasy splintered inwards, crashing off its hinges with a deafening crack. Men in dark blue uniforms and flat caps poured into the room, their voices sharp and commanding. "Police! Nobody move! This is a raid!" Panic ignited. Tables were overturned, sending glasses shattering to the floor. Women screamed, their laughter and flirtations instantly replaced by shrill cries of fear. Men scrambled, trying to ditch their flasks or find an exit, their bravado evaporating in the face of billy clubs and steel-toed boots. At the head of the charge was a broad-shouldered man with a face like a bulldog and eyes that burned with righteous fury. Detective Walter Corrigan. He was a rare breed, an honest cop which, in Arthur Sterling's world, made him the most dangerous man of all. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She had been through raids before, but Corrigan's presence meant this was serious. Her mind raced. A night in the drunk tank, a fine public humiliation. That was the best-case scenario. But she was a witness, however unwilling, to a murder. If Corrigan identified her, he wouldn't let her go. He'd squeeze her, press her, use her as a pawn in his obsessive crusade against the city's underworld. She would be trapped between the law and the men who had killed her brother. Instinct took over. While the chaos drew every eye, she slipped behind the heavy velvet stage curtain, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The air back here was thick with the smell of dust and stale liquor. A narrow, grimy corridor stretched before her, leading to the one place the police might overlook, the back alley exit. She ran, her beaded dress catching on rough wooden crates, her heels clicking softly on the filthy floor. The sounds of the raid faded to a dull roar behind her, replaced by the frantic drumming of her own pulse in her ears. The heavy steel door was just ahead, a promise of escape into the rain-drenched anonymity of the night. She shoved the rusted handle with all her might. The door groaned open, and she stumbled out into the alley, gulping at the cool, damp air. She collided with a wall of dark, wet wool that smelled of expensive cologne, whiskey, and the cold night air. It didn't yield an inch. Strong, firm hands gripped her upper arms, not to harm her, but simply to steady her, to stop her flight. Evelyn looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Rain dripped from the brim of a dark fedora, shadowing a face carved from granite. Even in the dim light filtering from a distant street lamp, she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the unyielding set of his mouth. But it was his eyes that stole her voice, pale, shockingly clear, and as cold and empty as a winter sky. They held no warmth, no pity, only an unnerving, absolute calm. It was Arthur Sterling, her boss, the phantom who owned the stage she sang on. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice trembling. His grip didn't loosen. "And go where, Miss Reed?" His voice was a low rumble, gravel and silk, a sound that seemed to absorb the noise of the city around them. "Into the arms of Detective Corrigan. He is a man of many questions, and I suspect he has a few reserved just for you." Footsteps echoed from inside the corridor she had just fled. The police were coming. Panic clawed at her throat. She struggled against his hold, a futile gesture against his immovable strength. "Please," she begged, the single word a surrender. Arthur Sterling looked down at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she saw something flicker in the depths of his eyes. Not pity, but a flicker of grim understanding. He had seen this kind of desperation before. He had thrived on it. "You have two choices," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The first leads to a cold cell, endless questions, and the very unpleasant attention of both the law and Mr. Gallows' associates. They will break you one way or another." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The second choice is my car, waiting at the end of this alley." Evelyn stared at him, confused. "Why?" A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. "Because I have a use for a songbird who has heard a secret. You will be safe under my protection." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more chilling than any shout. "And in return you will belong to me." The sound of the approaching footsteps grew louder. A beam of a flashlight cut through the doorway of the club. Evelyn looked from the encroaching light back to the impenetrable darkness of Arthur Sterling's eyes. It wasn't a choice between freedom and captivity. It was a choice between two different cages. One was made of iron bars. The other, she suspected, was far more dangerous. Without another word, his hand moved from her arm to the small of her back, a gesture of ownership, not comfort. He propelled her forward, away from the police and deeper into the shadows of the alley, towards the low, black silhouette of a Ford Model T sedan idling silently by the curb, its engine a soft, rhythmic purr in the pouring rain. She didn't resist. She couldn't. Her song of escape had ended, and a far more terrifying melody was just beginning. The journey in the Ford sedan was swathed in a heavy, suffocating silence. The city, a dazzling and chaotic symphony from the outside, became a silent film through the rain-streaked windows. Streetlights and neon signs bled into long, watercolor strokes of red, blue, and gold as the car moved with unnerving smoothness through the labyrinthine streets. Evelyn sat rigidly on the plush leather seat, the dampness of her dress seeping into the expensive material. She was acutely aware of the man beside her. Arthur Sterling did not speak, did not move, did not even seem to breathe. He was a statue of quiet, menacing authority, his profile a stark silhouette against the passing city lights. She could feel the intensity of his presence, a palpable force that seemed to suck the very air from the confined space. She risked a glance at him. His hands rested on his knees, his long fingers perfectly still. There was no sign of the violence and chaos they had just left behind. It was a chilling disconnect. The man who commanded such a brutal world possessed an almost preternatural calm. He was the eye of his own hurricane. The car slowed and turned into a private cobblestoned drive, stopping before a building that pierced the night sky like a needle of limestone and granite. It was one of the new, magnificent Art Deco towers on Park Avenue, a monument to wealth and ambition. A doorman in a crisp, dark uniform rushed out with a wide umbrella, his face a mask of practiced deference as he opened the car door for Arthur. He paid the man no mind, his attention fixed solely on Evelyn. "Come," he said. It was not a request. His hand was at her back again, a firm, guiding pressure that left no room for argument. He led her through a cavernous lobby of polished marble and gleaming brass, the click of her heels echoing like gunshots in the cathedral-like silence. They didn't approach the main bank of elevators, but instead went to a single, unadorned brass door. Arthur produced a key, and the door opened to reveal a private elevator, its interior paneled in dark, polished mahogany. As they ascended, Evelyn watched the floor numbers light up, climbing higher and higher, until they stopped at the very top. PH, the penthouse. The doors slid open not into a hallway, but directly into a living space so vast it made her gasp. The entire far wall was a series of floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the city. Manhattan was spread out before them like a king's treasure map, a glittering carpet of 1,000,000 tiny lights under a bruised, stormy sky. The rain-slicked streets far below looked like veins of liquid silver. The apartment was a masterpiece of modern luxury. Geometric patterns were etched into the dark wood floors, which were partially covered by a plush cream rug. The furniture was sleek and low-slung, made of lacquered wood and chrome, softened by velvet cushions in shades of emerald and sapphire. A magnificent grand piano, its black lacquer gleaming like a pool of ink, occupied a place of honor near the windows. The air was clean, carrying the faint masculine scents of cedar, leather, and the whiskey Arthur favored. It was beautiful. It was exquisite. And as the heavy elevator doors slid shut behind them with a soft, definitive click, Evelyn knew with chilling certainty that it was a prison. "You can remove your coat, it's damp," Arthur said, his voice startlingly loud in the quiet room. He moved towards a built-in bar, his movements economical and precise. He poured 2 fingers of the same amber whiskey he'd had at the club into a heavy crystal glass. He did not offer her one. Evelyn remained by the door, wrapping her arms around herself. "What is this place? Why did you bring me here?" "This is my home," he answered, turning to face her, the glass in his hand. "And I brought you here because, as I said, you are safer here than anywhere else in this city. Detective Corrigan cannot reach you. Gallows' men cannot reach you. Here, you are untouchable." "Untouchable? Or your property?" she shot back, a spark of defiance cutting through her fear. His eyes, cold and assessing, met hers across the expanse of the room. "The two are not mutually exclusive." He gestured towards a sweeping staircase that led to an upper level. "There is a bedroom upstairs, second door on the left. You'll find everything you need. Clothes, toiletries. My housekeeper has an eye for what a woman might require." The calculated presumption of it all, the clothes waiting for her as if her arrival had been an inevitability, sent a chill down her spine. "You planned this. You were waiting for the raid." "I anticipate possibilities," he corrected her smoothly. "It's how I've managed to stay alive. Now we need to discuss the reason you are here. Your brother, Eugene." The name hit her like a physical blow, and she flinched. All the fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by the familiar heavy weight of grief. "What about him?" she whispered. Arthur took a slow sip of his whiskey, his gaze never leaving her face. "He worked as a bookmaker for Clarence Gallo. He was ambitious but careless. He skimmed from Gallo's profits. Gallo does not tolerate such disrespect. He made an example of your brother in a warehouse down by the docks 2 months ago. He spoke of her brother's murder with the dispassionate tone of a man discussing a business transaction." Evelyn's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Clarence Gallo is my rival," Arthur stated simply. "His business encroaches on mine. His methods are crude and draw unwanted attention. He is a rabid dog that needs to be put down. Destroying him is not only good for my business, it is a service to this city." He set his glass down with a soft click. "And you, Miss Reed, are going to help me do it." Evelyn stared at him, bewildered. "Me? What can I possibly do?" He took a step closer, and then another, closing the distance between them until he stood only a few feet away. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "The police reports were vague," he said, his voice dropping lower. "But my sources are more thorough. They say you were waiting for Eugene in a car down the street on the night he was killed. You were supposed to leave town together. You didn't see what happened, but you heard it. You heard the voices. You heard Gallo." A memory, sharp and jagged, tore through her mind. The muffled shouts, the sickening thud, and then a single clear voice cutting through the night, barking an order. The sound had frozen her in place, a rabbit mesmerized by the headlights of an oncoming car. "You heard something specific," Arthur pressed, his eyes boring into hers. "A name, a place, a piece of a plan. Something you might not even realize is important. I want that piece, Miss Reed. I want you to give me the weapon I need to dismantle Gallo's entire operation." The cold reality of her situation crashed down upon her. He hadn't saved her out of kindness or even morbid curiosity. He had saved a tool. She was a key he needed to unlock his rival's demise. She was nothing more than bait. "No," she said, the word coming out stronger than she felt. "I won't be a part of your filthy war. The world you and Gallo live in is what killed my brother. I won't help you perpetuate it." Arthur's expression did not change, but a dangerous stillness settled over him. "I am offering you something the law never will," he said, his voice like velvet draped over steel. "Justice, vengeance. Call it what you will. The men who murdered your brother will pay for what they did. Isn't that what you want?" "What I want," she spat, her voice thick with unshed tears, "is my brother back. What I want is to be left alone, to sing my songs and be forgotten. I will not be a pawn for you to sacrifice in your game." For the first time, a flicker of something, not anger but perhaps surprise, registered in his eyes. He was a man unaccustomed to being denied anything. He took the final step that separated them, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was so close she could see the faint lines etched around his eyes, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a pale relic from a forgotten battle. "You misunderstand your position," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "You are not my pawn, you are my guest, but you are not free to leave. You will remain in this apartment until you give me what I want. Whether you do so willingly or after weeks of quiet contemplation is entirely up to you." He reached out, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was going to strike her. Instead, his fingers brushed a stray, damp strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was shockingly gentle, yet it felt like being branded. It was a gesture of ownership, a silent claim. "The world you knew is gone, Evelyn," he murmured, using her first name for the first time, the sound intimate and jarring. "This is your world now. You would do well to get used to it." He turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the thick rug, leaving her standing alone in the center of the magnificent room. He didn't look back. Evelyn stood frozen, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She looked past the grand piano, past the elegant furniture, to the wall of windows. The city lights twinkled back at her, beautiful, indifferent, and impossibly far away. The cage was locked, the melody had stopped, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone with the man who held the key. The first few days of Evelyn's confinement passed in a blur of surreal luxury and profound silence. Time stretched and warped in the penthouse, which floated above the city like a ship on a sea of clouds, detached from the rhythm of the world below. Her defiance, once a burning flame, cooled into the stubborn, glowing embers of passive resistance. She was a ghost in her own gilded prison, drifting through rooms that felt more like museum exhibits than living spaces. The housekeeper, a stern, silent woman named Clara, laid out exquisite meals that Evelyn barely touched, and presented her with a wardrobe of shimmering silk dresses, soft woolen cardigans, and delicate chiffon nightgowns that felt like a costume for a life that wasn't hers. Every need was anticipated, every comfort provided, yet each gesture was another bar in the invisible cage. Arthur Sterling was a phantom. He was gone for long stretches of the day, his absence as palpable as his presence. When he was home, the vast apartment seemed to shrink, the air crackling with a low, humming tension. He never forced conversation. He would sit in a low-backed leather armchair, reading the paper or a leather-bound book. The only sounds the rustle of a page turning and the soft clink of ice in his whiskey glass. He watched her, she knew, even when he wasn't looking. His quiet, constant observation was a form of pressure, a patient waiting game she was determined not to lose. Her only solace was the grand piano. For 2 days she avoided it, viewing it as another of his possessions, another part of the trap. But the silence of the penthouse was a physical weight, pressing in on her, amplifying the frantic thoughts in her head. On the 3rd afternoon she could bear it no longer. She needed to make a sound that was her own. Hesitantly she sat on the polished bench. Her fingers, trembling slightly, hovered over the pristine ivory keys. She didn't play the blues she sang at the club. That music belonged to a world of smoky rooms and shared sorrows. Here, in this cold, perfect space, she needed something else. She began to play a Chopin nocturne, a piece full of complex melancholy and fragile hope. The notes filled the silent apartment, weaving a tapestry of sound that was achingly beautiful and profoundly sad. It was a lament, a prayer, a rebellion. She closed her eyes, losing herself in the music, channeling all her fear, grief and fury into her fingertips. She didn't know how long she played. When the final, mournful chord faded into silence, she opened her eyes and saw him. Arthur was standing by the archway to his study, motionless. He wasn't looking at the piano or her hands. He was looking at her face. His expression was one she had never seen before. The cold, calculating mask was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded stillness. In the depths of his pale eyes, she saw not the crime lord, but a flicker of the man he might have been, a man who understood the language of sorrow. He held her gaze for a long moment, then turned without a word and disappeared back into his study, leaving the echo of her music hanging in the air between them. The dynamic shifted after that. The silence was still there, but it was different, laced with a new, unspoken awareness. He had heard her, not just the notes, but the soul behind them. He began leaving sheet music on the piano. Debussy, Satie, complex atmospheric pieces that challenged and captivated her. It was a strange, silent courtship, a conversation held through the compositions of dead men. One night, a storm raged outside, the wind howling around the corners of the building, rattling the great windows. Sleep was impossible. Evelyn, wrapped in a silk robe, padded barefoot into the main living area, intending to get a glass of water. She stopped dead. Arthur was standing before the vast wall of windows, his back to her. He was just a silhouette against the dramatic backdrop of the storm-lashed city, lightning periodically illuminating the scene in stark, flashing detail. He was dressed only in dark trousers and a white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. A glass of whiskey was in his hand, but he wasn't drinking. His other hand was pressed flat against the cold glass, his knuckles white. He was utterly still, but she could feel the storm inside him raging in sync with the one outside. She must have made a small sound because he turned, his movements sharp, defensive. In the brief, flickering light of another lightning strike, she saw his face. The mask was gone again. His expression was haunted, his eyes wide with a horror that had nothing to do with the present moment. He looked like a man staring into an open grave. He looked like a soldier still lost on a battlefield. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I couldn't sleep." His composure snapped back into place like a steel trap, but it was too late. She had seen the crack in his armor. "The storm," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It's loud." She knew it wasn't the storm. She walked slowly towards him, stopping a few feet away. "It's not the storm, is it?" she asked softly. He turned back to the window, his jaw tight. "You should be in bed." "So should you," she countered, her voice gentle but firm. "But the ghosts won't let you, will they?" He was silent for a long time, the only sounds the howl of the wind and the distant cry of a siren. "The things you see," he said finally, his voice rough, directed at the window, at the past, "they don't stay buried. They find their way out in the quiet." For the first time she saw him not as her captor, but as a fellow prisoner, chained to a history he couldn't escape. An impulse of empathy, reckless and profound, moved her. She walked to the bar, her hands surprisingly steady as she poured a small amount of whiskey into a clean glass. She brought it to him. He looked from the glass to her face, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. He took it from her, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. A jolt like static electricity passed between them. They stood there for what felt like an hour, side by side, watching the storm, sharing a bottle of forbidden whiskey and the deeper intoxication of a shared, unspoken pain. "My brother Eugene," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "He used to laugh at everything. Even when things were bad, he'd find something to laugh about. The silence he left behind, it's louder than any storm." Arthur took a long, slow drink from his glass. "In France," he began, his voice strained. The silence was the worst part. After the shelling stopped, you'd just wait, listening for the screams. Sometimes you couldn't tell if they were yours or someone else's. It was a confession, a shard of the darkness he carried. He was giving her a piece of his pain, a currency more valuable than any money he possessed. The line between them, captor and captive, predator and prey, was dissolving in the rain and the whiskey and the shared darkness. She looked up at his face, at the hard lines and the shadows in his eyes. He was no longer just the monster who had caged her. He was a man forged in fire, a man who had walled off his own heart so thoroughly that all that was left was a cold, empty fortress. And in that moment she felt a terrible, dangerous pity for him. He must have seen the shift in her expression, because he turned his head, his gaze dropping to her mouth. The air grew thick, heavy, charged with a voltage that had nothing to do with the storm. The space between them collapsed. "Evelyn," he breathed, her name a sound of surrender. He lowered his head, and his mouth captured hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hard, desperate, a collision of loneliness and hunger. It was freighted with all the unspoken words, all the silent screams, all the grief and rage that had filled the space between them. There was a raw, bruising intensity to it, a claiming. He tasted of whiskey and regret. One of his hands came up to tangle in her hair, holding her fast, while the other gripped her waist, pulling her flush against him. For a shocking, breathtaking moment, she kissed him back. Some broken, lonely part of her responded to the broken, lonely part of him. It was a desperate, primal need to feel something, anything, other than the cold ache of loss. It was a flicker of warmth in the center of a raging storm. Then, just as suddenly as it began, he broke away. He stumbled back a step, his breathing ragged. His eyes were dark, turbulent, and for the first time since she'd met him, filled with a raw, chaotic emotion she couldn't name. He looked at her as if she were a ghost, a weakness, a fatal mistake he had just made. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the room, leaving his half-empty glass on the windowsill. Evelyn stood frozen, her fingers rising to touch her lips. They were bruised, tingling. The silence that rushed back in to fill the room was heavier than before, no longer empty, but charged with the memory of that kiss. The storm outside raged on, but the storm inside her had just begun. The captor had revealed his wounds, and the captive had just discovered a terrifying new bar in her gilded cage, the bar of her own treacherous heart. The morning after the storm, the penthouse was still and silent, but it was a new kind of silence. The comfortable emptiness was gone, replaced by a dense, charged atmosphere thick with unspoken words and the ghost of their kiss. Arthur was once again a creature of shadow and discipline. The crack in his armor had been sealed, welded shut with a cold, impenetrable fury directed as much at himself as at the situation. He moved with a renewed, almost brittle formality, his eyes sliding past Evelyn as if she were a piece of the expensive furniture. For Evelyn, the emotional whiplash was dizzying, the shared vulnerability, the bruising passion. It had all vanished with the dawn, leaving her feeling exposed and foolish. She had seen the man behind the monster, and the sight had been both terrifying and dangerously alluring. Now the monster was back in full control, and the memory of his touch felt like a brand, a secret shame that only the two of them shared. He finally broke the silence 2 days later. He found her at the piano, her fingers tracing a melody of aimless confusion. He didn't approach. He stood by the bar, a blueprint of a building spread out before him, his posture all business. "It's time," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "We are moving against Gallo." Evelyn's hands fell from the keys with a discordant clatter. She turned on the bench to face him. "What do you mean, we?" "I have arranged a performance for you," he continued, ignoring her question. "At the Blue Dahlia. It's a jazz club downtown, neutral territory. Gallo won't be able to resist the chance to see the famous songbird from my ruined club, especially now that she has disappeared." The implication was clear. The entire underworld thought she was either dead or in his bed. Both conclusions served his purpose. "You want me to sing for him?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "To be the cheese in your mousetrap?" "You will be the centerpiece," he corrected, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were ice. "Gallo is arrogant. He will come to gloat, to see what Sterling values enough to hide away in his tower. He will bring his senior lieutenants. While he is distracted by the music, my men will secure the exits and eliminate the competition." The casual brutality of his words stole her breath. He was talking about a massacre, planned as calmly as a business merger, And what happens to me, the centerpiece? Am I supposed to just keep singing while your thugs shoot the place to pieces? You will be protected, he said, a flicker of impatience in his tone. My best man, Howard, will be near you at all times. The moment the music stops, he will get you out. You will be perfectly safe. The moral chasm at her feet widened into an abyss. This was the choice he had always intended for her. To become an active participant in his violent world, to use her voice, the one pure thing she had left, as a lure for murder. All to avenge a brother who had been destroyed by this very same world. The irony was a bitter acid in her throat. And if I say no, she challenged, her voice trembling. Arthur rolled up the blueprint with a slow, deliberate motion. Then you will remain here in this beautiful, silent room until you either change your mind or wither away from the sheer pointlessness of it all. Gallo will continue to thrive, and your brother's death will remain nothing more than a squalid footnote in this city's history. The choice, as always, is yours. He left her then, the unspoken ultimatum hanging in the air like cigar smoke. For the next 24 hours, Evelyn was trapped in a storm of her own making. She paced the vast apartment, the city lights below mocking her confinement. Part of her screamed in protest. This was madness. She was a singer, not an assassin's accomplice. Helping Arthur would mean staining her hands with the same blood that covered Gallo's. But another darker voice whispered back, the voice of grief. It showed her Eugene's smiling face, then the dull, empty look in his eyes, the last time she'd seen him at the mortuary. It reminded her of the smug, untouchable men who walked the city's streets, men who could take a life and then go out for a steak dinner. The law was powerless, a joke told in back rooms and paid for with fat envelopes of cash. Arthur, for all his monstrousness, was offering the one thing no one else could, a reckoning. Was it vengeance? Or was it just a different kind of cage, one she was choosing to walk into herself? In the end, did it matter? The ghost of her brother deserved to rest, and she was beginning to believe that the only way to silence his memory was with the thunder of retribution. The next morning, she found Arthur in his study. She stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. "I'll do it," she said, her voice small but firm. "For Eugene." Arthur looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. "I knew you would," he said simply. There was no triumph in his voice, only a quiet, grim finality. Meanwhile, in a cramped, smoke-filled office downtown, Detective Walter Corrigan stared at a map of the city, dotted with red pins, each one marking a known Sterling or Gallo enterprise. He was a man running on stale coffee and pure, unadulterated rage. The raid on the gilded cage had yielded nothing but a few low-level bootleggers and a hefty fine for the tailor upstairs. Sterling had slipped through his fingers again, and the singer Evelyn Reed, the one witness who could tie it all together, had vanished into thin air. He knew Sterling had her. The thought of her, a potential key to his entire case, being held by that cold-blooded killer, ate at him day and night. His desk phone rang, a shrill, jarring sound. He snatched it up. Corrigan. The voice on the other end was muffled, distorted, as if speaking through a handkerchief. It was a practiced, anonymous whisper. "You want Sterling?" the voice rasped. Corrigan sat bolt upright, his senses on high alert. "Who is this?" "A friend. You want to crack this city wide open? You be at the Blue Dahlia on Friday night. Sterling's making a play for Gallo, and he's using the girl as bait." There was a click and the line went dead. Corrigan slammed the phone down, his mind racing. It was a trap. It had to be. A setup to make the police look like fools or worse, get them caught in a crossfire. But what if it wasn't? What if this was the break he'd been praying for? A chance to catch both Sterling and Gallo, red-handed, with the girl as his star witness. The risk was enormous, but the prize was everything he had worked for. The chord of betrayal had been struck, and Walter Corrigan could already hear the symphony of chaos it promised. On Friday night, Evelyn stood before a full-length mirror in her bedroom. She was wearing a gown of deep crimson silk, a dress that shimmered like liquid fire. It was cut low in the back, its beaded fringe designed to catch the light with every movement. It was a warrior's dress, a siren's call. Arthur appeared in the doorway behind her, his reflection joining hers in the glass. He was dressed in a flawless black tuxedo, a vision of dark, lethal elegance. For a moment, they just looked at each other's reflections. The space between them was electric. He stepped forward and held out a small velvet box. A final touch. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a delicate diamond necklace. It wasn't ostentatious, but it glittered with a cold, fierce light like a string of captured stars. or frozen tears. "I can't wear this," she whispered. "You can," he said, his voice a low murmur next to her ear. He took the necklace from the box. His fingers, cool and steady, brushed the bare skin of her neck as he fastened the clasp. The contact sent a shiver through her entire body. He let his hands rest for a half-second on her shoulders, his thumbs stroking her skin. It was a gesture that was both possessive and strangely reassuring. "Tonight," he said, his lips close to her hair, "when you sing, sing only for them. Make them forget there is a world outside that room. Make them forget everything but your voice." He paused. "And when the music stops, you find Howard, do you understand?" She met his gaze in the mirror. His eyes were dark, intense, and for a fleeting moment she saw a flicker of something beyond the cold calculation, a sliver of genuine concern. Or perhaps it was just the anxiety of a general sending his most valuable soldier into battle. "I understand," she said, her voice barely audible. He nodded, the moment broken. He was all business again. He stepped back, leaving her alone with her reflection. The girl in the mirror looked beautiful, poised, and utterly terrified. She was a perfect, glittering piece of bait. As she followed him out of the room and towards the elevator that would take her down into the heart of the city's darkness, she felt the weight of the diamonds on her skin, cold and heavy as a chain. She was no longer just a singer. She was an instrument in a symphony of death, and the first terrible note was about to be played. Do you believe love can conquer secrets and lies? Tell us in the comments. The Blue Dahlia was a different world from the Gilded Cage. Where Arthur's club had been intimate and shrouded in conspiratorial darkness, the Dahlia was a sprawling, opulent ballroom of a place. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, like a frozen explosion, casting a dazzling, fractured light over the sea of tables below. A full brass band occupied the large stage, their instruments gleaming. The air hummed with the frenetic, joyful energy of the Charleston, a stark contrast to the cold knot of dread tightening in Evelyn's stomach. She was led through a back entrance to a small private dressing room. Howard, Arthur's man, was a quiet, imposing figure who had been assigned to her side. He was older than Arthur, with a face like a worn leather map and eyes that missed nothing. He had the calm, unsettling demeanor of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Mr. Sterling is in position," Howard informed her, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "He has eyes on everything. You are to go on in 5 minutes. Sing 3 songs. The last one will be Saint Louis Blues. When you sing the final note of that song, that is the signal. Turn and walk off stage to your left. I will be waiting for you in the wings. Do not stop. Do not look back. Just walk to me. Understood?" Evelyn nodded, her throat too dry to speak. He was treating her like a soldier receiving battle orders, which she supposed was exactly what she was. She looked at her reflection in the lit mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger, her face pale beneath the stage makeup, her eyes wide and dark. The crimson dress felt like a target. The diamond necklace was an icy weight against her skin. A knock on the door, and the stage manager called, "Miss Reed, 2 minutes." Howard gave her a final, appraising look. "Just remember the music, girl. Nothing else." He then slipped out of the room, melting back into the shadows. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked towards the stage. The announcer's voice boomed through the club. "And now the Blue Dahlia is proud to present a voice that will capture your soul, the incredible Miss Evelyn Reed." A wave of polite applause washed over her as she stepped into the blinding spotlights. She walked to the microphone at the center of the stage, the band striking up the introduction to a slow, sultry ballad. She squinted against the lights, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. The room was packed, and then she saw him. Clarence the Butcher Gallo was sitting at a ringside table, exactly as Arthur had predicted. He was a large, florid man, stuffed into an expensive but ill-fitting suit. His face was fleshy, his eyes small and cunning, like a pig's. He was flanked by several hard-faced men, their suits bulging in all the wrong places. Gallo was smiling, a wide, predatory grin, as he watched her. He raised his glass to her in a mocking toast. He was gloating, just as Arthur said he would. The sight of him, the man who had ordered her brother's death, sent a jolt of pure, cold hatred through her. It was an emotion so powerful it momentarily eclipsed her fear. This was for Eugene. She opened her mouth and began to sing. Her voice at first was thin and shaky, but then she channeled the hatred, the grief, the terror, and poured it all into the music. The song transformed. It became a lament, a cry of defiance, a promise of retribution. The club grew quiet. the chatter and laughter dying down as her voice, rich and sorrowful, filled every corner of the vast room. She wasn't just performing, she was casting a spell. She didn't dare look for Arthur, but she could feel his presence. She imagined him somewhere in the shadows of the upper balcony, a silent, watching hawk. She sang her first song, then her second. The applause was thunderous. Gallo was no longer smiling. He was leaning forward, captivated, his brutish face a mask of unexpected fascination. The trap was working. Then the band started the familiar, mournful intro to St. Louis Blues. This was it, the signal. Her heart pounded in time with the slow, heavy beat of the drum. She gripped the microphone stand, her knuckles white. She sang the first verse, her voice dripping with a bluesy melancholy that felt terrifyingly real. I hate to see that evening sun go down. She scanned the room one last time. She saw Gallo and his men completely enraptured. She saw Howard, a subtle shadow in the stage wings to her left. She saw the club's patrons, lost in the music. Everything was in place. It was then that she noticed a man at the bar. He wasn't watching her. He was watching the main entrance, his hand inside his jacket. His posture was tense, coiled. He wasn't one of Arthur's men. She could feel it. Something was wrong. And then another man near Gallo's table subtly shifted his chair, creating a clear line of sight not to the stage, but to the upper balcony where she suspected Arthur was hiding. A horrifying realization dawned on her. This wasn't just Arthur's trap for Gallo. It was a trap for Arthur too. Someone had betrayed him. This was a double cross. Panic seized her. She had to warn him. She looked towards the balcony, trying to find his silhouette in the darkness, to send some kind of signal. But it was too late. The first gunshot was a deafening crack that shattered the spell of the music. It came from the bar. A woman screamed. Chaos erupted. The symphony was broken. Men at tables who had looked like ordinary patrons suddenly stood, producing guns from beneath their jackets. It was an ambush. Gallo's men, caught by surprise, fumbled for their own weapons. The man by Gallo's table didn't fire at Arthur's men. He turned and fired 2 shots directly into Clarence Gallo's chest. The big man slumped forward onto his table, a look of stunned surprise on his face, his champagne glass shattering in a spray of blood and crystal. The room devolved into a war zone. Gunshots echoed like a barrage of deadly fireworks. Patrons screamed and dove under tables. Evelyn stood frozen on the stage, paralyzed by the sheer brutal violence unfolding before her. The spotlights seemed to pin her in place, making her the most visible person in the room. Suddenly, a body flew through the air and landed on the stage with a sickening thud. Howard. He had been shot, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He looked at her, his eyes wide with shock, and mouthed a single word: "Run." But then a figure came vaulting over the balcony railing, landing on the stage with a grace that defied the chaos. It was Arthur. In his hand was a pistol, and his face was a mask of cold, lethal fury. The icy calm was gone, replaced by the ferocity of a cornered wolf. He ignored the carnage around him, his eyes locking onto hers. "Evelyn!" he roared over the gunfire. He lunged for her, pushing her down behind the grand piano, just as a spray of bullets tore through the microphone stand where she had been standing moments before. He shielded her with his own body, returning fire into the crowd, his movements precise and deadly. The heat from his body, the smell of gunpowder, the deafening roar of the gunshots. It was a sensory nightmare. "We have to move," he yelled, pulling her along the floor, keeping the piano between them and the shooters. Then, just as the first wave of gunfire seemed to die down, a new sound cut through the chaos, the shrill blast of police whistles. The main doors burst open, and a flood of uniformed officers led by a grim-faced detective Walter Corrigan poured into the club. "Police, drop your weapons!" For a moment the shooting stopped, a tense standoff descending upon the bloody ballroom. Arthur, his arm still protectively around Evelyn, slowly lowered his weapon. He was bleeding from a cut on his temple, his perfect tuxedo now stained with dust and blood. Corrigan's eyes scanned the room, taking in the bodies, the terror, the carnage, and then his gaze landed on them. He saw Arthur Sterling, the city's most notorious crime lord, and he saw Evelyn Reed, his star witness, huddled under his protection. But that's not all he saw. On the floor near her hand, where it had been dropped by one of Gallo's dying men, lay a small, nickel-plated pistol. To Corrigan, a man already convinced of her complicity, the scene was damning. The singer wasn't a victim. She was part of the massacre. "Sterling, let the girl go," Corrigan yelled, his own gun trained on Arthur. Arthur looked down at Evelyn, then at the gun near her hand, then back at Corrigan's advancing officers. He saw the scene through the detective's eyes. A setup, a perfect, undeniable frame-up. The anonymous tip, the chaos, the gun conveniently placed at her feet as it all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The betrayal wasn't just against him, it was designed to implicate her. And in that split second of devastating realization, the last vestiges of the man who had listened to Chopin nocturnes and shared whiskey in a storm died. The wound of this betrayal was deeper, more personal than any he had ever suffered. And the pain, swift and blinding, manifested as ice. He looked at Evelyn cowering beside him, and in his mind, twisted by the chaos and the evidence before him, there was only one possible conclusion. She was the traitor, the tip to Corrigan, the gunman waiting for him. It had all come from her. Their shared moments, the kiss, her reluctance. It had all been part of the act, a performance far more convincing than the one she had just given on stage. His expression hardened into something she had never seen before, a look of utter and complete revulsion. The protective arm around her went limp. He rose slowly to his feet, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender, his eyes never leaving hers. The look he gave her was colder than any bullet. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He had protected her, he had let her in, and she had driven a knife into his back. "Take her," Arthur Sterling said, his voice flat and dead, loud enough for Corrigan to hear. "She's all yours." With that, he turned his back on her, a final, brutal act of abandonment. Police officers swarmed the stage. Rough hands grabbed Evelyn's arms, hauling her to her feet. She looked past them, her eyes pleading with Arthur, but he would not look at her. He simply stood there, a solitary, rigid figure amidst the wreckage of his own making, allowing the police to take her away as the broken symphony of sirens wailed around them. The world became a cacophony of shouting voices, flashing camera bulbs, and the cold, impersonal touch of the law. Evelyn was dragged from the blood-soaked ballroom of the Blue Dahlia in a state of profound shock. The crimson of her dress was indistinguishable from the bloodstains that spattered its hem. Her mind was a maelstrom of confusion and terror, but one image burned brighter than any other, Arthur's face in that final moment, the absolute certainty of her guilt in his eyes, the cold, dead finality with which he had turned his back on her. That look hurt more than any bullet could have. It was a wound to her very soul. She was taken to a precinct station that smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and despair. Her diamond necklace was unceremoniously unclasped and dropped into an evidence bag. She was fingerprinted, her hands stained with black ink, a mark of her new identity as a criminal. Detective Walter Corrigan interrogated her under the harsh glare of a single bare bulb. He was relentless, a bulldog with a bone, his questions a barrage of accusations. "Who was the target, Miss Reed? Sterling or Gallo? How long have you been working for him? Your anonymous tip was very helpful, but you didn't count on us getting there so quickly, did you?" Her denials were met with cynical sneers. Her pleas of innocence were dismissed as lies. To Corrigan, the pieces fit together perfectly. She was Sterling's woman, a honey trap used to lure Gallo into the open. The anonymous tip was just a clever insurance policy, a way for Sterling to have the police clean up his mess and take out a rival at the same time. The gun at her feet was the final nail in the coffin of her credibility. The charge was murder and conspiracy. The evidence, circumstantial as it was overwhelming. She was thrown into a holding cell. The iron door slammed shut with a clang that echoed the closing of a tomb. The glamour of the penthouse, the warmth of the stage lights, it all felt like a fever dream. This was her reality now, a cold stone bench, a filthy blanket, and the echoing moans of the city's forgotten souls. She was alone, utterly and completely abandoned by the one man who could save her, the very man who had cast her to the wolves. For Arthur Sterling, the hours after the ambush were a blur of calculated violence and icy fury. He had been taken into custody, but was released before sunrise. His lawyers, the best and most ruthless in the city, had descended upon the precinct like a flock of well-dressed vultures, armed with writs and threats that made even the most hardened cops back down. There was no evidence to hold him. He had been a patron in a club that had become a war zone. He was, on paper, a victim, but he was far from it. He was a king whose castle had been breached, whose trust had been shattered. The betrayal consumed him, a black poison that seeped into the wounds of his past, awakening old demons. He returned to the silent, immaculate penthouse, a place that now felt tainted by her memory. He saw her ghost at the piano, saw her reflection in the great windows. He swept a crystal glass from the bar, and it shattered against the marble floor, the sound a poor imitation of the explosion in his own soul. He had allowed himself a moment of weakness, a flicker of humanity, and she had used it to sharpen her knife. The shared whiskey, the kiss in the storm, her feigned reluctance, it was all a meticulously crafted illusion. She had played him with the same artistry she applied to her music. His rage required an outlet. It required a target. It required truth. He summoned his most loyal men, the hardened core of his organization, to his study. His face was a mask of granite. "I was betrayed," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Someone in this room, or someone who reports to someone in this room, sold me to Gallo, and they tipped off the police. They used the girl to do it." He paused, his pale eyes sweeping over each man, searching for any flicker of deceit. "I want a name. I don't care what you have to do, who you have to break, or what you have to burn. You will bring me the name of the traitor, and you will do it before the sun sets." His men, seeing a fury in him they had not witnessed since the early days of his rise to power, dispersed into the city's underbelly like a pack of hunting dogs. What followed was a brutal, systematic purge. Secrets were tortured from low-level informants. Loyalties were tested with terrifying precision. Arthur orchestrated the hunt from his penthouse, a general commanding a shadow war, fueled by whiskey and a singular burning need to confirm the identity of his Judas. The pieces began to come together throughout the day. The gunmen at the Blue Dahlia, who had targeted him, were not Gallo's men. They were mercenaries hired from out of town. The man who had shot Gallo was one of Gallo's own lieutenants, promised the throne in exchange for his treachery. The plan was intricate, multi-layered. It wasn't just about killing him. It was about dismantling his entire empire in the chaos that followed. It was a move of breathtaking ambition, and it required inside knowledge, deep knowledge. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, blood-red shadows across the city, when his men returned with the final piece of the puzzle. They brought with them a terrified, sweating bookkeeper who handled the organization's illicit payroll. After a few minutes alone with Arthur, the man confessed everything. The payments for the mercenaries, the anonymous tips, the planning, it all traced back to one man. It was not Evelyn. It was Howard, his quiet, dependable, loyal right-hand man, the man he trusted with his life, the man he had assigned to protect her. Howard, who had been positioning himself for years to take over, had made a secret alliance with Gallo's ambitious underboss and used the entire affair as a smokescreen for his coup. He had sold information to Gallo about the trap, sold information to Corrigan about the coming gang war, and planned to eliminate both Sterling and Gallo in a single, brilliant stroke. Howard's death on stage had been a ruse. He had worn a protective vest and used a blood pact to fake his injury in the chaos, planning to disappear and reappear later as the heir to the throne. Evelyn had simply been the perfect, tragic pawn in his master plan. The realization hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled back, leaning against his desk for support. The icy certainty that had fueled him for the past 24 hours shattered into a million pieces, replaced by a horror so profound it left him breathless. He had been wrong. He had been catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. The image of her face in the ballroom flashed in his mind. Her terror, her confusion, her pleading eyes. It hadn't been an act. It had been real. He had taken her genuine fear and twisted it into evidence of her guilt. He had stood by and watched, his heart frozen with a false sense of betrayal, as they dragged the only person who had breached his defenses into a cage of iron and stone. He hadn't just abandoned her, he had condemned her. The fury he felt before was a pale shadow of the rage that now consumed him, but this rage was not cold and calculating. It was white-hot, directed inward, at his own blind, wounded pride. He, Arthur Sterling, the man who anticipated everything, had been played for a fool not by a woman he barely knew, but by the man who stood at his right hand for a decade. He walked to the window and looked down at the city. Far below, in a cold, dark cell, Evelyn was facing a murder charge because of his monumental error. The system, manipulated by Howard's anonymous tips and Gallo's corrupt influence, would crush her. She would be convicted. She would be sent away for years, perhaps for life, her name and spirit broken, all because he had failed her. A new, terrifying clarity settled over him. His empire, his money, his power, it was all meaningless ash in his mouth. The cold, empty fortress he had built around his heart had been a prison of his own making, and Evelyn, with her sad songs and defiant spirit, had been the first ray of light to pierce its walls in a decade, and he had snuffed it out. The moment of decision arrived. It was the climax of his life, a choice that would define him not as a crime lord but as a man. He could cut his losses, let her fall, and focus on rebuilding his empire and hunting down Howard. It would be the smart move, the logical move, or he could burn it all to the ground to save her. He turned from the window, his eyes no longer empty, but blazing with a new, terrible purpose. He had built his kingdom on fear and control. Now he would use that kingdom to unleash a storm of chaos and retribution this city had never seen. He would not just save Evelyn, he would tear down the entire corrupt system that had her in its grasp. He would sacrifice his pawns, his knights, even his queen, his own untouchable position, if it meant getting her back. "Find Howard," he commanded his men, his voice a low, chilling promise of the violence to come. "Keep him alive. I want to look him in the eye myself. Then get me every piece of filth we have on every judge and police captain on Gallows' payroll, and find me the editor of the New York Herald. We are going to war, and tonight the entire city will burn." The requiem for a dream was over. The overture for a war had just begun. Arthur Sterling's war was not fought with armies in the streets, but with whispers and damning truths delivered in the dead of night. It was a swift, silent, and utterly devastating campaign. The city awoke to a hangover of its own corruption. The morning edition of the New York Herald screamed with headlines that sent shockwaves from the halls of power to the gutters of the Bowery. Secret ledgers, sworn affidavits, and damning photographs. Arthur's entire arsenal of blackmail and leverage collected over years had been anonymously delivered to the paper's editor. The story was a masterpiece of controlled demolition. It exposed Clarence Gallows' remaining organization not as a rival power, but as a network of thugs propped up by corrupt police officials and city judges, all of whom were named. Detective Walter Corrigan's obsessive crusade was revealed for what it was, a selective, compromised hunt, funded by anonymous tips from the very syndicate he was supposed to be fighting. The final brutal piece was the confession of a captured Howard, detailing how he had orchestrated the entire Blue Dahlia massacre to seize power, complete with a detailed account of how he framed Evelyn Reed. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Warrants were issued for half the city's vice squad. A respected judge shot himself in his chambers. Gallows' empire, decapitated and exposed, crumbled into dust overnight. And the case against Evelyn Reed, once a certainty, evaporated into a public embarrassment. She was released on a cold, grey morning, 24 hours after her world had ended. The process was impersonal and bureaucratic. A guard unlocked her cell. A matron handed her the crimson dress, now cleaned and pressed, in a cardboard box along with the contents of her purse. She was led through a series of corridors and steel doors, and finally pushed out onto the stone steps of the courthouse, blinking in the weak sunlight. The city she stepped into was the same, yet entirely different. The sounds were harsher, the faces of strangers colder. The trauma of the past days had wrapped her in a numb, invisible shroud. She had no money, nowhere to go. The life she had known, the small apartment she shared with her brother's ghost, had been left behind. She was free, but she had never been more lost. She started walking with no destination in mind, her feet carrying her east towards the river. She ended up at the docks, a place of endings and beginnings. The air was damp and smelled of salt, coal smoke and brine. The low, mournful groan of a ship's horn echoed across the water, a sound that matched the ache in her soul. She stood by a wooden piling, watching the grey, churning water of the Hudson, a lone, small figure against the vast industrial landscape of ships and cranes. She heard the soft crunch of expensive leather shoes on the gravel behind her, but she didn't turn. She knew who it was. The scent of his cologne, cedar, and whiskey reached her first. Arthur Sterling came to a stop beside her. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a simple dark wool overcoat, his fedora pulled low against the wind. He didn't look at her, but out at the departing ocean liner, a plume of black smoke rising from its stacks. They stood in silence for a long time, the chasm of his betrayal between them. "The SS Aquitania sails for Southampton in 1 hour, he said finally, his voice low and rough, almost carried away by the wind. "There is a first-class cabin reserved in your name. In the cabin, you will find a bank draft for $50,000, enough to start over. Enough to live anywhere in the world comfortably for the rest of your life." Evelyn said nothing. She continued to stare at the water, her expression unreadable. He finally turned to look at her, his face etched with a weariness she had never seen before. The icy control was gone, replaced by a raw, profound vulnerability. "What I did, what I believed, was unforgivable," he said, the words costing him more than all the money in his vaults. "I looked at you and saw a reflection of my own world, my own capacity for deceit. I was wrong. The mistake was mine, and it almost destroyed you. The ship, the money, it is a poor apology, but it is the only one I know how to make. It gives you a clean slate, it gives you your freedom, it keeps you safe from me and from the world I inhabit." He reached into his overcoat and produced a ticket and a passport. He held them out to her. It was everything he had described: escape, safety, a new life, a future free of gunshots and gilded cages, a future without him. "That is your first choice," he said quietly. She looked at the ticket in his hand, then up at his face, her twilight-grey eyes searching his for the first time. She saw the truth of his words there, the deep, agonizing regret. She saw the man from the storm, the man haunted by ghosts. "And the second choice?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cry of the gulls. Arthur's gaze held hers. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face, and he resisted the powerful urge to reach out and tuck it behind her ear. "The second choice," he said, his voice dropping, "is my hand. There is no ship. There is no money to start over. There is only a walk back into the city, back into the shadows. My life will never be safe. It will always be a war, a balancing act on the edge of a knife. I cannot offer you peace or goodness or an easy life. All I can offer you is my loyalty, my protection. All I can offer you is me, a broken man, for a broken woman. But you will never, ever be alone again." He lowered the hand holding the ticket and slowly, deliberately extended his other hand, palm up, an offering, a plea, a promise. Evelyn stood there, caught between two impossible futures. One was a sunlit, peaceful shore, but it was a shore she would have to walk alone. The other was a path back into the heart of the storm, but she would have a hand to hold. She looked at the ticket to a new world, then at the scarred, strong hand that had both imprisoned and saved her. She thought of the silence of the penthouse and the terrifying silence of the jail cell. She thought of the sad, beautiful music they had shared without a word. She had been running from her brother's ghost, seeking an escape. But perhaps escape wasn't a place. Perhaps it was a person. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, she slowly raised her hand. She did not take the ticket. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, possessive, and infinitely gentle grip. A current passed between them, sealing the silent pact. He did not smile. He simply nodded, a deep, shuddering relief washing over his features. Together, they turned their backs on the departing ship, on the promise of an easy escape. They turned and began the long walk back into the heart of the city, their two solitary silhouettes merging into one against the grey light of the dawn. They were not heroes. They were not saved. They were survivors who had found their only possible salvation in the wreckage of each other. True love is not always a gentle harbour from the storms of life. Sometimes it is the choice to walk back into the storm, hand in hand with the only person who understands the darkness you carry, finding not an escape from your ghosts, but a partner to face them with. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romances.